Welcome back to part 3 of playing around with texture magic. Now, we've spent a lot of time on how to do applique kind of work with texture magic, but I want you to know you can also use your texturized fabric in piecing. I'm going to be throwing together a really quick eyeglass case as a demo, but know that what I teach you about piecing can be used for piecing quilts with texturized fabric as well. You'll mark and cut your texturized fabric just as you would when working with regular fabric. Notice that I'm using my rotary cutter and there's no problem in cutting the texturized piece with either a rotary cutter or scissors. Now I'll be using my texturized fabric as an accent border for the top of my eyeglass case, so I'm cutting it a bit longer than I'll actually need since I can trim it once I've got it attached. When you go to sew your pieces together, you can pin right into the texturized fabric just like you would normally. The one trick about piecing to know is that when you cut into your texturized fabric, you will release all the puckers distal to the cut, and this will create an irregular edge to your fabric. No need to panic though. Just use the nice straight edge of the white texture magic as your seam guide, and you will come out with a perfectly accurate seam. Now I need to iron this seam under before I stitch it down, and I don't want to touch my iron to the texture magic itself because it might cause some stiffening. No big deal here. I just use an applique pressing sheet to protect my iron from directly touching the texture magic, and my seam is easily pressed without a problem. Notice that as I work on pressing the second seam, I can iron without a Teflon pressing sheet because no texture magic is exposed. I do try to use just the tip of the iron though, because I don't want to crush my lovely three-dimensional texturized fabric border. As I stitch this edge down, you can see just how easy it is to stitch directly on a piece of texturized fabric. Once this part is done, I simply sew my eyeglass case together and then finish the inside seam to hide the binding. And I'm left with an eyeglass case that looks extra interesting just because I've added this wonderful border of three-dimensional texturized fabric. How cool is that? So far, we've created all of our texturized pieces using stipple stitching as the way to attach the fabric to the texture magic, but know that you can stitch whatever kind of design you want on texture magic, including straight line stitching, and you'll get a really cool result. Here, we're going to shrink a piece that was straight line stitched in a grid pattern, and I've used a trapunto layer of wool batting. Now once it's been texturized, notice that it looks like a grid of tiny little puffy pillows. So, quilting designs that have a lot of repeat within the design will become accentuated if they are texturized. Okay, this is a piece of blended felt. It's wool and rayon blend. And what we're going to do is I'm going to do some stitching on it, and we're going to create a very interesting leaf shape that we can then use to applique onto a wall hanging. And what we'll be doing is stitching a series of just lines that keep repeating themselves inside the leaf. I've already attached it to a piece of texture magic. Now, when I'm doing a stitching like this green felt is so thick that it's really hard for me to see my stitching line as I'm working, and that's another nice property of texture magic because I have the option of flipping it over and stitching on this white area, and it's really easy to see. So from the standpoint of your finished product, it doesn't matter which side you do your stitching on, but know that you can choose to do it on whichever side makes the work easier for you. Okay, let's stitch it. Now you don't need to cut this out before you texturize it, but I'm going to do it only because it's going to be easier for you to appreciate that this really does make a beautiful leaf if it's already cut out, because if I leave all this extra felt and Texture Magic hanging off once I'm done texturizing, you're going to think, well, what's the big deal? So I'm just going to cut out, and I'm cutting just outside the edge of that stitched line. And again, once this piece has been texturized, you're going to just lay it on whatever the place is on your wall hanging that you want to put it, and do some kind of stitching to finish that edge, just like we did with the spider earlier. So satin stitch or any decorative stitch. And again, that's what we're starting with before we texturize. And I'm just going to even cut away some of that, because you don't want to, when you go to finish your edges, you're not going to want to deal with any white extra stuff. So those are real easy to just trim off. Okay, let's go steam it. And here we are shrinking that same leaf, and notice that there is no trapunto layer. Because the felt itself is very thick, we end up with these great texturized lines throughout the leaf. And you can do the same thing with cottons, as you can see here with a batik leaf, but because the cotton fabric is much thinner than the felt, the lines won't be as prominent. So far, we've only texturized some cotton fabrics and silk charmeuse fabrics, but don't limit yourself to just the kinds of fabrics you use in everyday quilting. Get out some really oddball stuff. See what's out there, and you'll be shocked at just how cool some of these fibers will texturize with Texture Magic. Here's a lovely piece of blended bamboo rayon felt, and here it is after texturizing. Again, there is no trapunto layer here, just the wonderfully plumped up texturizing of felt. If we look at texturized felt and texturized cotton, you can really appreciate just how much of an impact that underlying fabric has. Thicker fabrics will texturize as much plumper or fuller than traditional cottons or silks. And you don't need to do anything different in the texturization process, as you can see here as I shrink a piece of a wool rayon blend felt. And try out some kinds of oddball fabrics as well. This is a piece of dyed cheesecloth, and because it is such a loose weave, I folded it over to create a double layer before texturizing, and it came out really cool. And here's a piece of cotton velvet that was texturized with a trapunto layer. The three-dimensional texture from the Texture Magic draws you in to touch it, and then you realize just how soft the velvet is. There is no end to the fun you can have with this stuff. So whether you're using it for machine applique or traditional piecing, and no matter what kind of fabric you're using, you can add in some additional fun and interest with Texture Magic.